Chapter 103. The reason why the mags couldn't use their magic within the Malacca ruins was due to the dispersion of magical energy. Extracting magical power from within the body and arranging it into a specific structure forms the foundation of magic manifestation. However, in this space, the moment one tried to extract magical power, it would scatter into the air, rendering arrangement, and thus magic, impossible. This meant that even Theon, the one who had created this very situation, had been rendered magically powerless. However, there was one exception, alone. And the reason for this exception was clear. It's because I fixed the arrangement of magical power with the incantation of stabilization. In other words, he had the ability to enforce the laws of magic through the use of incantations, no matter the situation. If not for the hint carved into the wall, I'd probably have ended up as bug food while trying to figure out a solution. Not that the current situation isn't dangerous as it is. Even so, it wasn't a moment to relax. Even if he could use magic, the fact that the environment actively dispersed magical energy was still a massive disadvantage, not only for Alone but for any mage. No matter how much magical power I pour in, arranging it still takes time, which lowers efficiency. And the Ho Gaftu, in memory of the black eye, and the bracelet are unusable as well. In short, the most I can manage is 3 spells at best. Remaining calm, Alone analyzed the current situation and scanned his surroundings. Mutated creatures resembling mosquitoes the size of humans were flying through the air, emitting the distinctive threatening buzz of insects. It wasn't just the air. They clung to moss-covered rocks. They crawled along the walls of the ruins. They scattered across the floor. Even behind him. The entire ruin was horrifyingly infested with grotesque, insect-like monsters. This is insane, Tilda. While Alone was surveying the area, Theon's voice, filled with shock, echoed from the front. Logically, it shouldn't even be possible to use magic here. Theon, dumbfounded, stood with his mouth agape. Despite his companion's heightened reaction, Alone devoted all his focus to calmly assessing the situation. I need to take care of everything in a single strike. Numerous large-scale area spells that could resolve this predicament flashed through Alone's mind. Unfortunately, none of them could be used right now. If he were to cast one of those spells here, Evan and the other mags would inevitably get caught in the blast. No, rather than possibly, it was an unavoidable certainty. However, handling the bugs one by one with precision strikes wasn't a viable option either. He simply didn't have enough chances to cast magic. And as he pondered this dilemma, a thought suddenly struck him. Wait a second. If magical power disperses like this? His eyes lit up as he arrived at an idea. Decomposition. He spoke quietly. The feeble trace of magic that had been lingering just a moment ago was abruptly dissolved and disappeared. In an instant, it was broken down into tiny particles and scattered throughout the space. The faint hope the mags had clung to vanished, replaced by sighs of resignation escaping their lips. See? I knew it wouldn't work, Tilda. Even Theon, who had started regaining some confidence, gave a dejected wave of his dark staff. At that moment, when the bugs hovering in the air turned menacing and began to shift, Alone maintained his composure. Behind his expressionless face, his thoughts remained steady. So even if it disperses, magical energy doesn't actually disappear. He surveyed his surroundings. Even though grotesque insects were lunging at him with lethal intent, Alone did not despair. Because he could see it. The magical energy he had just decomposed was now naturally scattered throughout the space, a result of this chamber's peculiar properties. And more importantly, the moment he realized that, despite the diffusion, the control of the magical energy spread across the chamber was proceeding exactly as he intended. Who? Letting out a light breath, Alone formed a seal with his left hand while maintaining his calm. Then, with his right hand, he executed a Ji-Quan-In, earth seal. Cheongwang, pure light. Pajijijik. Once again, atop Alone's palm, a radiant orb of lightning surged into existence, starkly different from the feeble spells earlier. It shone brilliantly, dazzling the surrounding area. Acceleration. With that, the lightning orb devoured the surrounding air, unleashing a brilliant spectacle of electric blue light. And in the moment when the spike-like jaws and limbs of the mutated creatures were about to touch Alone's body. Designation. A blinding flash was unleashed. Quagagagagagag. Without a moment's hesitation, the orb of lightning that Alone had created tore mercilessly through the flying insects. The heads of the bugs that rose into the air before plummeting back down. The body of a bug that was about to crush Alone's hand as it moved sideways. the curved torso of an insect bearing its proboscis, aiming for his heart. With trails of radiant blue light, as if guided by precision, the lightning pierced only the insects. In mere moments, the flash wiped out every single bug. Quorjik! Finally, as if wrapping up its rampage, the lightning struck Theon's heart just as he was hastily attempting to swing his staff again, and then it vanished. Soon, a rain of the mutated creatures began to fall onto the floor of the ruins. Their limbs flailed as their green luminescent bodily fluid splattered down, dripping onto the heads of the mags. Yet not one of them made an effort to avoid the falling carcasses of the insects. Even Li Yan, whose head was soaked in the greenish liquid, stood still without bothering to wipe it off. She simply stared in one direction. It was toward where Marquis Palacio stood. Ah! A faint exclamation escaped from Li Yan's lips. What emotion was mixed in that low, drawn-out sound? Even she couldn't identify it herself. And standing at the center of all the gazes directed his way was Alone. Ah! I'm going to die. Having overused his magical power, Alone felt the symptoms of mana depletion creeping up on him after just 2 spells. Behind his stoic expression, he was inwardly on the verge of tears. Shortly afterward, having gulped down a potion for emergency treatment, Alone realized that his mana had returned to normal from the moment Theon had died. Marquis! What is it? What was that just now? Even during practice, I've seen you use similar spells, but I've never seen that kind of magic before. You probably won't see it again, either. Because I'm never using it again. Alone grabbed his still dizzy head and made a firm resolution. The magic he had just used was a combination of 2 incantation-based spells. First, he had deliberately decomposed and dispersed his magical power throughout the room, taking advantage of the environment's property of scattering mana. Then, he manipulated the dispersed magical energy, arranging it in specific patterns that only targeted the bugs and Theon. Finally, he used a second incantation to guide his magic to precisely strike only the designated patterns. And that was how the spell had been completed. However, as he had already stated, there would likely never be another instance where he would use that spell again. The very method relied on mana scattering to work, which meant it was only applicable under extremely rare circumstances. Additionally, the level of control it required was absurdly inefficient. The proof of that inefficiency was the throbbing headache that still hadn't gone away. I see. Well, it was really impressive, though. Magic isn't something you use to look impressive. Well, sure. I didn't mean it like that, just saying. It was hard to tell how much time had passed while he was talking to Evan. Marquis, I apologize. And thank you so much. Alone soon found himself receiving Li Yan's gratitude. There's no need for you to bow so deeply. How could I not? If it weren't for you, I would have already died. Truly, thank you. Li Yan bent her waist into a deep bow, nearly at a 90-degree angle, expressing her gratitude. Alone, uncomfortable with the gesture, once again told her that it wasn't necessary. Well, then. I was wondering if... Just as Li Yan lifted her head and began to speak. Kujiu gung. Suddenly, the ruins began to tremble. The mags, who had just moments earlier been calmly retrieving their tools in preparation to leave the ruins, now tensed up with wary expressions. But contrary to their expectations. A staircase. The massive tremor subsided, and what appeared before them was a staircase that had formed in the central arena, where there had been nothing just moments before. The staircase led underground. The mags all came to a realization simultaneously. This was the place Theon had just mentioned earlier, the location of the object. But that realization lasted only a moment. Marquis, please take this item with you. Are you sure that's acceptable? Of course. It's something everyone has already agreed upon. As Alone turned his gaze at her words, he saw the other mags bowing their heads in unison. It's the first time I've seen a group of mags bowing like this, Evan whispered as he watched the scene unfold. Then I won't refuse, Alone replied. Taking the item into his hands, Alone didn't hesitate as he began to descend the stairs leading underground. Before long, he came upon a single door with an inscription written on its surface. The words, written in a strange ancient script that Alone could read just like before, said, "To the mage who remembers the incantation of unification after escaping to the end, a legacy of harmony is left behind." Alone stared intently at the inscription for a moment before opening the door. With a grating creak, the door swung open. Contrary to his expectations of darkness, the room beyond was bright enough for him to see clearly. Inside, Alone saw two things. The first was an egg. A black egg resting atop an altar, so dark it seemed to absorb all the light in the world. The second was a series of letters. Specifically, Harmony of Shadows. The words, which appeared to be the key to self-manifestation, were written on the wall behind the ominous black egg. As Alone stepped closer to examine the egg more carefully, H.M. he noticed an old parchment lying next to the egg, inscribed with ancient writing as well. The contents were as follows. Never allow the shadow dragon to consume anything but mana until it is born. If the shadow dragon consumes a mage's blood beyond a certain threshold, the egg must be broken. Failure to do so will result in the shadow dragon transforming into a death shadow dragon, causing it to go berserk. 2 warnings in total. Having read this, Alone quickly pieced together what Theon had been trying to do. Was he attempting to turn the shadow dragon into a death shadow dragon? Although the reasons behind it were unclear, one thing was certain. Someone intentionally orchestrated this to provoke a mage into turning the shadow dragon into a death shadow dragon. He briefly considered the forces working behind Theon. But another thought soon surfaced in his mind, prompting him to tilt his head. This one was about the Queen of Asteria, Cretinia Scion. Theon himself admitted to the attack, so there's no connection there. But considering she sent me here, it's clear she knew something about this. Although it was true that rumors about Alone using ancient-era magic had circulated among mags, even so, there were parts of this situation that defied explanation. She did say I'd understand why she told me to come to the Malacca ruins once I got here. That much was certain. Moreover, this Malacca ruin was a place that required the ability to read ancient texts to fully comprehend its significance. Which meant Cretinia Scion knew that Alone could read ancient script, and that whatever was here would be of use to him. What is going on here? Alone's expression grew more puzzled, but only for a moment. First things first, let's head back up. Pushing aside his thoughts for now, he picked up the pitch-black egg and began his ascent back to the surface. The egg was incredibly heavy. At that moment, we should be arriving soon. Inside what could only be described as a room disguised as a carriage, Scion sat comfortably as it traveled back toward Tyria. At her words, her secretary, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. Your Majesty seems to be quite concerned about Marquis Palacio. Concerned, you say? Scion leaned deeper into the carriage's backrest. Does it seem that way to you? Forgive me, but yes, it does. Well, you're not wrong. Forgive me again, but may I ask, what part of him makes you so concerned? What part, indeed? Scion pondered the question briefly before a soft smile spread across her lips. Who knows? She turned the question back to her secretary instead. What do you think it might be? The secretary dared not answer. However, the secretary couldn't help but notice that Scion's golden eyes, the legendary gilded eyes of history, seemed to shine more brightly than usual, though perhaps it was merely an illusion. Chapter 104. The day after Alone returned from the ruins of Malacca. It's really pitch black. Yeah. And inside this, there's that dragon thing or whatever, right? Yeah. Then when is it going to hatch? Evan's question left Alone silent. Naturally, even he didn't know when the shadow dragon would be born. If only it had shown up in the game, I might have some clue. Even after playing Psychedelia for an exceptionally long time and exploring every corner of its world, Alone had never seen or heard of the shadow dragon. In other words, he had zero knowledge about it. Think the Information Guild would know anything? I doubt it. That's not really their area of expertise. Really? Well, they deal with current rumors and worldly affairs, not ancient lore like this. Unless, of course, it's somehow tied to ongoing rumors. Alone considered Evan's words, then let out a small exclamation. Ah. Did you think of something? Alone nodded. Yeah. Someone just came to mind. Who? In Rhine. Evan looked puzzled, but Alone, who knew about the Eternal Library, thought to himself. Could Rhine know something? He was well aware that most information not barred by her knowledge restrictions was stored in her mind. I should pay her a visit. Soon, he stood up. Marquis? Where are you going? To the next destination. What? We've only been back from the ruins for a day. Wouldn't it be better to rest a bit? Evan was understandably surprised, having seen Alone exhaust himself considerably. But Alone was firm. No, I plan to finish the itinerary as quickly as possible. Why? Because I want to rest. This place is way too humid. Ah. Evan nodded in agreement. That's true. You really dislike humid places, don't you? Yeah. It's too uncomfortable to rest here. Evan gave him a quizzical look, as if asking, is it really that bad? But Alone was completely serious. I can't rest here at all. Alone wasn't particularly picky about accommodations. During his earlier travels, he'd camped out frequently and had no complaints about enduring deserts or even the bustling port cities. But humidity was his nemesis. I need to wrap this up quickly and get out of the jungle. Resolving to leave as soon as possible, Alone rose from his seat. Around that time. Marquis, are you in? Lian. Yes, sir. Lian had come looking for Alone. Did you sleep well? Yes, thanks to you. Lian glanced away, smiling awkwardly. Alone asked. So, what's the matter? Well, I just came to let you know I'm heading back. Already? Yes. Considering what happened yesterday, it seems best to leave now. Indeed, it would have been too much to continue the expedition. Alone nodded, signaling his understanding. That makes sense. There's also been some strange activity near the magic tower this time. Strange activity? Yes, which is why I need to return to the tower quickly. Understood. Then, let's meet again sometime. At Alone's parting words, Lian's face brightened. Yes, I'd really like that. Oh, and next time, would you like to have a meal together? A meal? Yes, since you saved my life, I'd like to treat you. After a moment of thought, Alone nodded in agreement. If that's the case, then all right. Then please make sure to visit the Red Tower sometime. I will. Lian bowed deeply, then turned and left. Watching her go, Evan spoke up. She seems much friendlier than before. Does she? Yes. It's probably because of your impressive magic. That topic again? It's not just a topic, it really left an impact. That's all I'm saying. Alone let a quiet smirk slip past his stoic expression at Evan's remark. Let's go with that. With that, Alone resumed preparing to leave, a stray thought crossing his mind. Was it really that impressive? Having finished his preparations, Alone left Evan behind and headed alone to the hermit's hideout to protect the recently discovered dragon egg. Evan, having been tasked to guard the egg, eagerly nodded with a grin, clearly ready for the job. Alone chuckled softly at the sight before heading northeast toward the Sylvanus Zone. The Sylvanus Zone was notoriously dangerous, home to mutated monsters of all kinds. Normally, Alone wouldn't dare enter such a place alone. However, he felt secure thanks to a unique blessing, Imariana's blessing. Reaching the massive statue marking the border of the zone, Alone observed the moss-covered figure resembling an unnamed goddess. Approaching the statue, he clasped his hands together and bowed his head. After about 5 seconds, he spoke. Great Goddess Imariana, grant me the sight to navigate this zone. In return, I shall offer what belongs to you. As he finished, a faint light emanated from the moss-covered statue, gradually flowing into Alone. A satisfied smile spread across his face. With Imariana's blessing, the Sylvanus Zone no longer posed any danger to him. Unless he attacked first, the monsters would not perceive him, allowing him to wander the forest freely. The blessing came with a condition, though. He had to collect scattered relics in the forest and offer them as tribute. It's not a difficult penalty. I can just retrieve a few items from the hermit's hideout. According to law, all items in the Sylvanus Zone were considered lost possessions of the goddess. Relaxed, Alone began his journey into the zone, though a stray thought about Deus briefly crossed his mind. Now that I think about it, Deus didn't return yesterday. I hope he's all right. He dismissed the worry with a shake of his head. Deus wouldn't die here, not in a place like this. He could defeat a swordmaster like it was nothing, after all. Only if Deus ventured into the domain of the 100 ghosts would there be any risk, and Alone was certain he hadn't gone that far. Reassured, Alone continued his trek northeast. After some time, he noticed an unusually massive tree in the Sylvanus Zone, its twin trunks twisting together to form a towering figure. From here, head directly to the right. Following his mental map, he veered right and walked leisurely for a while. Eventually, he realized he was nearing his destination. However, the sight that greeted him left him stunned. Piles of monster corpses, stacked as high as the massive trees, surrounded the hermit's hideout. These were no ordinary creatures, they included enormous lizard-like beasts capable of devastating entire villages and other rare, highly dangerous mutations. While Alone stared in disbelief, a voice called out. "Ah!" Turning toward the sound, he saw a middle-aged man clad in an incongruously bright blue robe, his presence starkly out of place in the jungle. The man smiled, his expression devoid of hostility, as he addressed Alone. "Entering a forest like this alone? You must have a lot of confidence in your skills. Is this your doing?" Alone asked cautiously. "Indeed," the man replied casually. "I wanted to conduct a leisurely investigation, but these mutated monsters wouldn't stop bothering me." The middle-aged man glanced at the pile of corpses and spoke casually. "Setting it up like this keeps everything away, except bugs." Alone instinctively realized that the man wasn't ordinary and spoke up. "May I ask your name?" "Salame Mikado." "Salame Mikado." Muttering the name to himself, Alone soon dropped his stoic expression, his mouth slightly agape. "The Tower Master of the Blue Tower. That's my title, though my disciple handles most of the work these days," Salame said with a hearty laugh, one that seemed almost too jovial for his age. He then turned his attention to Alone. "So, who are you?" "Forgive my late introduction. I am Alone Palacio." "Alone Palacio, the Marquis of Palacio." "Yes, that's correct." Hearing this, Salame's smile grew even brighter, like a child discovering a new toy. Alone, for reasons he couldn't quite place, felt a chill run down his spine. Soon after, amidst an oddly cordial atmosphere, their conversation continued. "By the way, what brings you here?" "I have some business in that place," Alone replied, pointing. "That place?" "The hermit's hideout." "Yes." "Interesting." Salame seemed amused and pressed further. "So, you're here to explore?" "Not exactly. I'm here for something inside." "Something inside?" Alone's response left Salame slightly puzzled. "So, you mean you're not here to study it but to take something from within?" "Yes." After a brief moment of thought, Salame finally spoke again. "Well, given that you wield primal-level magic, it's not surprising that you'd be interested in what's inside. May I offer you some advice?" "Please do." "Turn back now. It'll save you a lot of trouble," Salame said firmly. His tone wasn't condescending. Salame respected all mags by principle. His warning was based on his first-hand knowledge of just how absurdly well-guarded the hermit's hideout was. The base enchantment is a triple-layered spell, and to even enter, you have to reverse-engineer all the magic seals. That's just to clear the first barrier. It had taken Salame himself an entire year just to open the first gate and reach the second. That was why he felt compelled to warn Alone. "It took me a year to open just the first gate," Salame added. "Even so, I'd like to give it a try." "Well, I won't stop you." Though slightly annoyed that his sincere advice was disregarded, Salame couldn't help but feel a lingering fondness for Alone. After all, to Salame, a true mage was one who explored and sought knowledge. Those who merely relied on academic circles and second-hand reports were not true mags in his eyes. He's different from the younger mags these days. With this perspective, Salame decided to cheer on Alone as though watching a promising younger colleague face a challenge he himself had barely overcome. Roughly 30 seconds later. Rumble. With a loud, grinding noise, the first gate of the hermit's hideout began to open. "What?" Salame's jaw dropped in astonishment. Chapter 105. Salame Mikado, the master of the Blue Tower and an 8th-tier magician capable of wielding Origin, could not comprehend the current situation. He opened it? How on earth? He blinked his eyes, but the scene before him remained unchanged. Marquis Palacio had opened a door, one that had taken Salame 2 full years of grueling effort to unlock, in less than 30 seconds. And now, the Marquis was walking through it. Still stunned, Salame snapped back to his senses and tried to call out to the Marquis. However, by the time he gathered himself, the man had already crossed the first barrier and disappeared into the interior. Salame hurried to the now-opened first barrier, inspecting it with disbelief. To the untrained eye, it appeared as just another wall, but Salame, a magician of his level, understood what lay before him. He knew the incredible complexity required to open this seemingly ordinary passage. Only a magician of the 8th tier, like himself, could hope to dedicate the time and energy needed to unlock such a door. Yet there was something even more startling. The way it was opened, it's exactly the same as how I did it. The method Marquis Palacio had used to unlock the barrier was identical to the one Salem had painstakingly discovered over the course of a year. What is going on? Confusion and question swirled in Salem Mikado's mind. He turned to peer further into the passage Marquis Palacio had entered. While Salem had always harbored some curiosity about the Marquis, the extent of his interest was limited. After all, the man was someone his arrogant disciple, Pena, admired, a man who still used outdated, primitive magic techniques. But meeting the Marquis in person had tempered Salem's curiosity. Sure, the rumors and Pena's actions hinted that the Marquis might be someone extraordinary, but Salem's first impression of him didn't align with such lofty expectations. His mana is low, his magical achievements barely scrape the 4th tier, and he hasn't even awakened his inner eye. Even giving him credit for using primitive magic, he's still below average. The numerous flaws Salem noticed made him regard the Marquis as an inferior magician, a junior lacking in potential. He even wondered, albeit briefly, what on earth Pena had seen in this man to inspire such fear and admiration. But these thoughts were fleeting. Salem soon found himself trailing the Marquis, following him to the second barrier. And there, in front of the second barrier, the one even Salem had yet to breach, stood the Marquis, seemingly lost in thought. Watching him, Salem hesitated to speak. Instead, he decided to observe, curious about what the Marquis might do. The second barrier was something Salem had never managed to open. In truth, he doubted whether it was even possible to unlock it. Like the first barrier, the second looked unremarkable at first glance. But to Salem's awakened eyes, it revealed itself as a labyrinth of thousands of intricately layered magic circles. Thousands upon thousands of complex and intertwined magical constructs, so convoluted that even Salem had yet to fully grasp their entirety. Despite this complexity, Salem's keen intellect had already deduced the theoretical method to unlock it. Find the key magic circle among the thousands. However, he had not yet succeeded in identifying that key. If the barrier were a literal door, it would be one riddled with tens of thousands of keyholes. Testing each magic circle individually was practically impossible, as it required unraveling and interpreting thousands of intricately intertwined constructs, a task that would take decades, if not longer. Salem, recalling this fact, felt a pang of despondence. And yet, Marquis Palacio, or rather, Alone, turned his head slightly, as if sensing Salem's interest. Of course, Alone had no real reason to pay attention to Salem. Building a rapport with the master of the Blue Tower could be useful, but it wasn't critical to his plans. Alone's wariness stemmed instead from the peculiar expectation reflected in Salem Mikado's eyes. Earlier, when Alone had opened the first barrier without much thought, Salem had stared at him, mouth agape, his expression utterly incredulous. Now, Salem was standing just a few paces away, watching him with childlike curiosity, as if waiting for him to perform another miracle. He said it took him a year to open the first door. Alone didn't think Salem Mikado was foolish. On the contrary, he found him monstrous. According to what Alone knew, the 2 barriers guarding this hermit sanctuary were said to be unsolvable by 12 7th-tier magicians working together for half a year. For Salem, an 8th-tier magician, to have unlocked the first barrier on his own was a testament to his extraordinary abilities. Precisely because of this, Alone found the man's expectant gaze incredibly burdensome. Alone opened the gates to the hermit's hideout. Simply because he knew the correct answers. The key to the first barrier lies in mana interference. Twist the straight mana flow into a half circle, and it opens. The second barrier? The key is the 5th magic circle from the top right diagonal corner. With such knowledge, Alone could easily open the doors by merely channeling his mana. Yet, the palpable expectation radiating from Salem behind him made it impossible for him to act without hesitation. If Alone were to effortlessly open the gate with a mere flow of mana, Salem would inevitably realize a bitter truth, that the grueling year of research he had poured into the task had been utterly pointless. Alone didn't have to care about Salem Mikado's emotions. But as someone who studied magic himself, he understood the crushing despair that would come with such a realization. Should I just use some magic? By the time Alone decided to offer Salem a well-intentioned lie, Salem, observing Alone's hesitation, began to interpret it as a struggle. Perhaps the second barrier is more challenging for him, after all. The flicker of expectation in Salem's eyes faded as he tried to temper his own hopes. And then, in that moment, who? Marquis Palacio let out a small sigh and formed a seal with his hands. Selene, intrigued, watched intently. Although he had heard that the Marquis used primitive magic, this was the first time he had seen it in practice. As he carefully observed Alone's technique, he noticed the Marquis murmuring something faintly under his breath. Then, a small orb formed between Alone's thumb and forefinger. Selene felt it immediately. What? A primal sense of danger surged through Selene Mikado. Instinctively, he furrowed his brow and began to gather mana to cast a defensive spell. His reaction was nearly instantaneous, a reflexive response. But then, what Selene saw stopped him in his tracks. Behind Alone, hovering in the air, were two enormous, unblinking eyes. Selene's thoughts froze, or rather, he forcibly stopped them. The moment he perceived those eyes, the moment they registered in his vision, he realized something undeniable. Understanding what lay before him would lead only to one possible outcome, death. The one thing Selene couldn't prepare for, however, was his own eyes. Having reached the 8th tier, his vision was honed to intuitively discern nearly anything it perceived. Unlike his mind, his eyes continued to analyze the phenomenon on instinct. And then, it began. The world around Selene darkened. When his gaze finally focused, he saw it. A circular abyss, a void so profound it seemed to pull his very being into its depths. What followed was a flash of pale pupils within that darkness. The last thing he saw was Q. A massive eye. A colossal presence so overwhelming it reduced him to an insignificant speck. It was looking directly at him. I'm going to die. The realization struck him, and for a brief, hollow moment, Selene's mind blanked. Then, Goo-goo-goo-goo-goo. A thunderous sound roared in his ears. Snapping back to his senses, Selene looked ahead. There it was. The second barrier, which had resisted all his efforts for over a year, was now slowly creaking open, the heavy door grinding against itself. Beyond the opening stood Marquis Palacio, looking back at him. His expression was devoid of emotion, utterly indifferent. Ha! Seeing this, Selene Mikado let out a dry laugh, almost involuntarily. He's been hiding his true power all along. That's what it was. Even though it lasted less than a second, the mere act of witnessing it had left Selene Mikado's mana in disarray and his hands trembling uncontrollably as he tried to cast his magic. And yet, he couldn't stop laughing. Even with the shadow of death looming so close, his laughter refused to cease. It was his unrelenting curiosity that kept him going. The same insatiable drive that had elevated him to become the master of the Blue Tower and an 8th-tier magician. Now, that very curiosity was captivated by the overwhelming magical knowledge that Marquis Palacio clearly possessed, knowledge that surely concealed power far greater than what Selene had just glimpsed. And so, Selene laughed. Watching this reaction, Alone, the Marquis, couldn't help but think. Wait, is he actually enjoying this? In the middle of using his magic, Alone had thought, surely, as an 8th-tier magician, Selene Mikado wouldn't be fooled by something as superficial as this simple demonstration. Yet there he was, beaming radiantly, as though delighted beyond words. Alone found himself momentarily stunned by the unexpected sight. Having passed the second barrier, Alone finally stepped into the inner chamber of the hermit's hideout. The interior was underwhelming, dimly lit, resembling the simple interior of a rustic, fantasy-style dwelling nestled within a cave. But Alone hadn't come for the scenery. Without hesitation, he approached a desk tucked into the corner of the sanctuary. And there, he found what he sought. Got it. Unlike the dark bracelet he had obtained before, this time, the object was a bracelet painted pure white, the asterisk white hand of the Wanderer Star. Alone placed it carefully into his belongings, allowing himself a brief smile. Then, he noticed a piece of parchment on the desk, inscribed in an ancient language. Lowering his gaze, he read the text. To the half-hearted magician who refused to compromise, who did not forget the forgotten words. I leave behind my legacy. Alone paused. The phrasing struck him as familiar, it was nearly identical to what he had encountered when acquiring the egg of the Shadow Dragon. After staring at the parchment for a while, Alone shrugged and set it back down. As he turned, his gaze fell upon Selene Mikado, who was still smiling, brightly, almost uncomfortably so. Slightly unnerved, Alone addressed him. I've taken everything I needed. If there's anything you want, Master of the Blue Tower, feel free to take it. In truth, there was little of magical value left behind, no books or texts on magic were anywhere to be seen. Is that so? Then I'll graciously accept, Salim replied, walking toward the desk Alone had just vacated. There, he noticed the parchment Alone had briefly inspected. Picking it up, Salim realized it was written in an ancient language he couldn't read. Without a word, he quietly tucked it away. Under normal circumstances, he might have asked Alone about it. However, Salim interpreted the Marquis's act of leaving it behind as a subtle message, perhaps a silent request to let the matter rest. He likely wants me to keep this to myself. Believing that questioning Alone would yield no answers, Salim decided to take the parchment to the Master of the Red Tower, who was known for his expertise in deciphering ancient texts. Salim's thoughts drifted. Despite the parchment's content, what he truly wanted was to converse with Alone about magic. His curiosity was not something that could simply be stifled. And so, I'll need to find a way to get closer to him. As Salim pondered how to bridge the gap, an idea struck him. Penia. Remembering his disciple, Salim suddenly understood why the arrogant Penia had been so enamored with Marquis Palacio. It didn't take long for him to devise a plan. Rather than remaining strangers, wouldn't it be easier to get closer to him if he were my disciple's husband? Whether he was prioritizing his disciple or his own insatiable curiosity was unclear. But one thing was certain. I'll make sure this works. Filled with determination, Salim looked at Alone with an intensity that could almost be described as fiery. Why do I feel uneasy? Seeing Salim's expression shift into something oddly determined, his laughter now bordering on unsettling, Alone couldn't shake the sense of foreboding. Something strange was brewing, and Alone could feel it. Chapter 106. Before the night deepened, Alone returned to the camp with Salim Mikado, who no longer had a reason to continue his research after the hermit's hideout opened. Are you asking about how to ascend to the next rank? That's correct. I assumed there would be some information about that there. As they conversed on their way back to the camp, Alone contemplated Salim's response. There probably isn't anything beyond the 8th rank. According to Alone's understanding of the psychedelia system, a mage capable of using origin magic would reach the pinnacle at the 8th rank. I see. Indeed. Although it wasn't as significant as I expected once we got there, it wasn't a waste. I gained plenty by studying the magic circle at the gateway. Alone quietly nodded at Salim's cheerful laughter. He didn't want to dampen Salim's enthusiasm for exploring magic to ascend further, even though he found it unnecessary. Then again, just because the system doesn't mention anything beyond the 8th rank doesn't mean the 9th rank couldn't exist. The thought crossed his mind. Speaking of which, what happened to Salim Mikado in the original story? Salim Mikado had never appeared in the original work Alone remembered. Even during conversations with the hysterical Penia in the original story, topics related to the Tower Lord were never mentioned. Did I forget? It's been so long, and my memory might be getting fuzzy unless I check my notebook. Alone recalled the notebook he had kept, jotting down useful knowledge about this world in his spare time to prevent forgetting crucial details. Still, I'm certain Salim didn't appear in the original psychedelia story. His certainty grew as he replayed every relevant moment in his memory. By the way, may I ask you something? What is it? When Salim cautiously inquired about how Alone had found the true key for the second gateway, Alone firmly refused to answer. I'm afraid I can't share that. In the mage community, it was considered impolite to ask about magic developed by someone else outside the established magic hierarchy. Alone used this etiquette to confidently decline. Not that it matters. My magic is mostly flashy tricks without any substance. As Alone pondered why his little white lie had worked, Salim continued to smile. Apologies. I was just too curious. It's fine. Well, perhaps if we grow closer, you might share the basics with me someday. Salim laughed heartily, and Alone briefly puzzled over the word closer. Well then, I should get going. Are you leaving? Yes, I have a lot to do. Even 2 bodies wouldn't be enough. Salim excused himself as soon as they arrived at the camp, which relieved Alone. Being around Salim had an inexplicably uncomfortable air. See you next time. Sure. Alone gave a casual reply to Salim's polite farewell and watched him vanish into the distance. Phew. He let out a heavy sigh. That's the second task done. As he walked toward the inn, Alone reviewed his next steps. Now, only the final task remains. To prepare for the Forgotten One, he reflected on the main reason he had come to the jungle. A presence, more than an item, was essential to his plans. Everything's ready. With that thought, he fiddled with the ring he had received from Heinkel and returned to the inn. You've returned, my lord. Deus? Yes, I'm back. The moment Alone entered, Deus greeted him with a respectful bow. Another figure, however, eyed Alone with a mix of disdain and irritation. So you're the Marquis? The man, tall and menacing, stood out. Alone immediately recognized him. Reinhard, who was meant to be Caliban's greatest swordsman, had finally appeared. Huge. I knew he was tall, but he's definitely over 2 meters. Without realizing it, Alone tilted his head back to look up at Reinhard. Even with Alone's own considerable height, Reinhard's towering presence was imposing. The rough and intimidating face of the man contrasted sharply with the noble-sounding name Reinhard, amplifying the tension in the air. Adding to the overall disarray, Reinhard's clothes had been reduced to near rags after spending an extended period in the jungle before Deus found him. In his current state, Reinhard resembled nothing more than a bandit, no more, no less. In psychedelia, even with his rough features, he had a clean, noble appearance that fit the image of a dignified knight. As Alone found himself staring at the stark contrast between the Reinhard he knew and the one before him, Reinhard frowned and spoke. What are you staring at? Since I introduced myself, you should. But before he could finish, a loud smack interrupted him, forcing his head to jerk forward. Mind your manners, Deus interjected. You bastard! Reinhard growled, glaring fiercely at Deus after being struck. Deus, however, remained calm and repeated, mind your manners. It's not me who's rude. Don't you have eyes? He's the one who. Weren't you the one who first spoke disrespectfully? I'm allowed to. No, you're not. Yes, I am. You may, but only if you can defeat me. GRRK. Deus's words struck a nerve. When he mentioned an apparent agreement between the two, something Alone wasn't aware of, Reinhard let out a guttural yell of frustration. Fine. I apologize for my rudeness, Marquis Palacio, Reinhard said with no sincerity, his voice laced with irritation. It's fine, Alone replied nonchalantly. Reinhard, displeased by the indifferent response, grumbled as he sat down, leaving Alone with a strange sense of unease. He was supposed to be a reckless character who'd never bow his head to anyone, seeing him like this feels awkward. Alone briefly shrugged off the memory of the promise Deus had casually mentioned earlier before shifting the conversation. Let's save the discussion for later and rest for today. That night, despite the persistent, sticky humidity, Alone managed to fall asleep quickly, as though he had grown accustomed to the discomfort. The following day, a light drizzle greeted Alone as he looked outside the inn. Soon, Deus shared some background on Reinhard. He came to the jungle to train. Yes. He mentioned spending time in the Selvanus region and the Northern Zone. The Northern Zone. That's correct. It was unusual. The Selvanus region was not a place one would choose for training, as it was rife with powerful mutated creatures. While a newly minted sword master like the prodigiously talented Filion might survive, it would still be an arduous experience. Training in a place like that, it's possible because it's Reinhard, but even so, the Northern Zone seems extreme. The Northern Zone, also known as the Territory of the 100 Ghosts, was a place even Deus would struggle with. The mutated creatures there were only slightly stronger than those in Selvanus, but the real problem lay elsewhere, the subordinates of the 100 Ghosts. From what I've heard, though, he didn't seem to spend much time in the Northern Zone. Really? Yes. It seems he spent most of his time in the Selvanus region. Nodding at the timely explanation, Alone couldn't help but marvel at Reinhard's strength. Yet his gaze drifted back to Deus. And Deus defeated someone like Reinhard. Is something wrong, Marquis? Deus asked, noticing Alone's lingering stare. Contemplating his response, Alone eventually spoke calmly. It's good to see. The sentiment carried a sense of paternal pride, as if watching a son achieve greatness. But saying so outright felt awkward, so Alone chose his words carefully. Is that so? Yes, you're doing well. Understood. Deus, perhaps feeling some sense of pride at Alone's words, displayed a rare, slightly smug expression. After some time passed in conversation, they finished a simple breakfast with Evan and Reinhard, who had also joined them on the first floor. Then Alone broached an important question. Deus, are you heading back now? I am. Will you not return with me, my lord? I have somewhere else I need to stop by. Then I'll accompany you. Haven't you accomplished your purpose? Shouldn't you be heading back? A few more days won't hurt. In truth, I was going to ask you to join me if you didn't mind. Thank you for offering. It's no problem. Deus's straightforward response prompted Reinhard to interject. So, am I supposed to wait here? Come along. Why should I do that? Reinhard retorted sharply, his tone defiant. So you don't run off again. What? Me? That's absurd. Did you think I wouldn't figure out you fled to the jungle to avoid calling me brother? Reinhard clamped his mouth shut at Deus's pointed accusation, his reason for escaping to the jungle, one Alone hadn't cared to know, laid bare. Witnessing the spectacle, Alone, who had been quietly enjoying the rare scene, cleared his throat. Evan, watching alongside him, leaned closer to ask softly. So, where are we going? To the Thunder Serpent tribe. The Thunder Serpent tribe, wait, you mean the one in the east? Yes. At Alone's confirmation, Reinhard frowned deeply. What? You're heading there? Marquis Palacio, do you even know what that place is like? Of course. The Thunder Serpent tribe's territory lay in the eastern zone, one of 3 areas the jungle camp had mapped. It remained the least developed region because of the tribe's strict policy of rejecting outsiders. You're aware they're there and still intend to go? Yes. Huh? Reinhard couldn't hide his disbelief, which earned him another smack. Oh. You bastard! Mind your manners. Do you have a death wish? If you'd like to see who dies first, be my guest. Reinhard erupted in anger after being struck again by Deus, but Alone remained composed as he watched the scene. If he knows about the Thunder Serpent tribe, that reaction is expected. In the game and its lore, the Thunder Serpent tribe was an exceptionally challenging foe. Each member of the tribe was at least as strong as a knight, and their combat efficiency doubled in the jungle. Adding to the difficulty was their mastery of curses. From the moment one became hostile to the Thunder Serpent tribe, over 10 different debuffs would start afflicting the intruder, persisting until they left the eastern zone. Even so, Alone wasn't overly concerned, Reinhard and Deus were by his side. Still, there was one reason for caution, the Thunder Serpent tribe had an absolute being they revered, a godlike presence. And that being was Alone's target. With that in mind, Alone stood up. Since we're done here, let's head out. To meet the Thunder Serpent tribe. By the time the rain had stopped, Alone's party began their journey toward the eastern zone, a region avoided by even the most daring explorers and mercenaries. About an hour or 2 after entering the zone, Reinhard glanced ahead at Marquis Palacio with faint irritation. Truthfully, Reinhard didn't like the Marquis. Not because Alone had wronged him directly, but because Reinhard often suffered incidental collateral damage because of him. What's so great about him that Deus gives those long-winded speeches during meetings? Reinhard couldn't understand why Deus always spoke so highly of Alone, almost as if it were second nature. Sure, he had heard through the nights about Alone's significant contributions during the Northern Campaign years ago, but surely that story had been milked long enough. The Alone he saw in person didn't seem particularly extraordinary, contrary to the tales. If it weren't for the knights who endlessly praised the Marquis after their northern expedition, Reinhard would have assumed the rumors were exaggerated. Already annoyed at being dragged out here instead of returning to Caliban, Reinhard was grumbling to himself when he suddenly drew his sword. They appeared. Draped in white animal pelts and wearing masks made of animal bones, a group of unknown individuals emerged like mirages in their path. Reinhard frowned deeply as he took in the sight. We've already fallen victim to their curses. He could feel his senses dulling as if submerged in water. Be warned, outsiders. This is the land of the Blue Serpent. Leave. The one speaking wore a mask adorned with 4 horns, and their guttural growl carried an undeniable weight of authority. Reinhard, unable to stop himself, let out a low whistle of admiration. Not a sword master, but close. To think someone without formal martial arts training could reach this level. Fascinated by the unexpected prowess of the masked figure, Reinhard's observation was short-lived. We've come to meet your chieftain. You dare ignore my warning. What Reinhard saw, or rather, was forced to see, was a breathtaking display. The moment Marquis Palacio finished speaking, a tribe member lunged forward, their long single-edged blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. Crack! In an instant, everything froze. Not just the blade. Around Marquis Palacio, the world began to crystallize with frost, as if nature itself was recoiling from his presence. The drizzle turned to ice. The surrounding plants shimmered with frost. Even the blade that had been thrust forward froze solid. And then, the hand that held the blade followed, encased in a glistening shell of ice. Everything froze. Reinhard, stunned by the spectacle, could only watch as his pupils widened uncontrollably. But it wasn't just the frozen surroundings that rattled him, it was what he saw behind alone. Two eyes glimmered in the void behind the Marquis. They radiated an ominous presence, one that seemed to deny even the concept of recognition itself. The sensation clawed at Reinhard's mind, gnawing at his sanity in an instant. Yet, what truly shocked Reinhard wasn't even that. It was the figure before him alone, his fur-lined coat billowing, and the two glowing eyes hovering ominously behind him. The image was hauntingly familiar. Somewhere deep within Reinhard's subconscious, it struck a chord, a scene he couldn't place but which felt seared into his memory. Compelled by instinct, Reinhard frantically searched his mind for the source of this familiarity. And then, it came to him. A year ago. When Reinhard had ventured boldly into a place of whispered rumors, only to flee in utter defeat. A single attack had shattered his sword mercilessly, leaving him with a crushing sense of failure greater than anything even Deus had inflicted. The statue? Yes, it was the statue. Behind the 100 ghosts, seated upon a massive boulder, was a towering sculpture carved into the face of a sheer cliff. And now, the image of that statue and the figure of Marquis Palacio standing before him were eerily, hauntingly identical. Chapter 107. Duke Comelin's office. Failure, you say? And Marquis Palacio took the dragon spirit's egg. Yes. At the dark elf's calm nod, Duke Comelin let out a dry chuckle. Marquis Palacio. What on earth was he doing where the dragon spirit's egg was kept? I couldn't determine the exact reason, but it seems he came at someone's request. A request? By whom? The Duke's question was met with silence from the dark elf. Realizing the lack of information, Duke Comelin sighed in frustration. Marquis Palacio, of all people. After pondering for a moment, he set down the fountain pen he had been holding and spoke again. What about the other preparations? Everything else is proceeding step by step, excluding the dragon spirit's egg. It shouldn't take long. The test subjects are progressing as expected. Hearing this, the Duke exhaled deeply. Ensure everything is prepared properly. Yes. And as for Marquis Palacio? The Duke fell silent once more. Shall we retrieve the dragon spirit's egg? The dark elf cautiously posed the question, but the Duke shook his head. No. Now that the awakening has failed, the dragon spirit's egg is no longer necessary for the plan. What should we do, then? Send the test subjects. The test subjects, you mean? Yes. They're no longer needed anyway, so dispose of them. If we can assess the Marquis's capabilities in the process, all the better. Understood. Send them with a convincing message. As the dark elf bowed and disappeared, Duke Comelin watched silently, his expression perplexed. How in the world did he manage to take the dragon spirit's egg? Unable to comprehend, his face reflected his confusion. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the ripples of unease stirring within him. At this pivotal moment, as the greater cause drew closer, he needed to remain composed. For that reason alone. All for the greater cause. He silently recited the phrase he had repeated to himself thousands of times. Was it a misunderstanding? Reinhard was aware. He understood that he might have been mistaken. No, he was acutely aware that it was overwhelmingly likely to be either a misunderstanding or sheer coincidence. Because logically, it made no sense. The back of Marquis Palacio, who resided in the kingdom of Asteria, couldn't possibly resemble the massive statue he had seen within the domain of the 100 ghosts. Surely, that must be it. Even as he acknowledged that it was illogical and likely a coincidence, he couldn't stop himself from superimposing the figure before him onto the image etched into his memory. The flowing black coat and the two eyes, one black, one blue. It was all too identical. The vivid memory of that moment was only heightened by the sheer terror of impending death he had faced at the time, engraving the sight of the 100 ghosts and the statue behind them indelibly into his mind. Lost in his daze, Reinhard stared blankly at the figure before him until... Exterminate the intruder? The sudden cry from the Thunder Serpent tribe jolted him back to his senses. He raised his sword, infusing it with magic. But then, he immediately stopped his actions. The Thunder Serpent warriors, who had seemed ready to charge with weapons drawn, now stood frozen, trembling uncontrollably. And at that moment, Reinhard saw it. The threads of Xian spread throughout the forest. Though invisible to ordinary eyes, those with magical perception could see the threads spreading like spiderwebs across the entire area, entangling every member of the tribe. The only one resisting was, damn it, the man who had been pointing his sword at Marquis Palacio. Unfortunately, even he was completely immobilized. Unlike the others, whose limbs were simply bound by the threads, the man standing directly before Alone was practically mummified in Xian threads, leaving only his face exposed. To what extent? The threads tightened with such precision that, in an instant, the man could have been reduced to nothing more than a lump of flesh. And Deus's expression, as he gazed at the man who dared to point a sword at the Marquis, was so cold it bordered on icy and unmistakable chill that anyone could perceive. It's not Caliban's sword, but Marquis Palacio's own, it seems. Reinhard, reflecting on the thought, watched as the fight ended almost too quickly, leaving him with a faint sense of deflation. I couldn't even fully grasp it, just how strong is that guy becoming? As Reinhard wrestled with a pang of jealousy toward Deus, who had once again taken a step forward in strength during the time Reinhard wasn't watching. Alone's eyes fell on a struggling member of the Thunder Serpent tribe, masked and twisting their body in resistance. It was the right choice to bring Deus, though. Alone let out a small sigh as he noticed the particularly bright, vivid threads of Xian shining in the air. Of course, he could have subdued the tribal member himself with the biting cold he momentarily unleashed, making conversation possible. Still, Deus's presence had undoubtedly made things much easier. Even so, a flicker of unease surfaced in Alone's mind. The reason? These vibrant threads of Xian, demonstrated for the first time by Deus in Alone's presence, bore a striking resemblance to the technique Deus had used during his awakening into Sin, if only the color of the threads were different. No, that can't be. Turning slightly, Alone cast a glance back at Deus. Shall I kill them, Marquis? Deus asked in his usual calm, detached tone. No. As Alone answered, he couldn't decide whether to feel reassured or more uneasy. This power could just as easily be the innate ability of a sword master, not something tied to his awakening into one of the 5 great sins. Still. Shaking off the thought, Alone turned his attention to the subdued tribesman, his brow furrowed slightly. Normally, they wouldn't gather like this so quickly after an outsider's intrusion. What's going on here? Surveying the dozens of Thunder Serpent tribe members surrounding him, Alone tilted his head in mild confusion before shrugging. Looks like we'll need to have a conversation. Watching the tribal member growl in a voice more beastly than human, Alone sighed. I'll come to the shallow place below the sky. Welcome the dawn with joy, as I will greet it with you. At Alone's sudden proclamation, Evan, Deus, and Reinhard exchanged puzzled looks. However, the slightly poetic, lengthy phrase seemed to strike a nerve. The once growling tribesmen froze, their eyes behind the mask reflecting astonishment. Noticing this change, Alone pressed further. How about it? Isn't this enough to grant me an audience with your chieftain? Alone himself had no idea what his words meant. But he had uttered them with such confidence because he vividly remembered encountering the Thunder Serpent tribe in the game. There had been a quest involving the tribe, and an NPC had used the exact phrase to gain entry without conflict. Confident yet cautious, Alone watched the tribesman. How do you know those words? The tribesman murmured in disbelief but ultimately relented. Follow me. Satisfied, Alone allowed a faint smile to surface. Entering the Thunder Serpent tribe's village, the first thing Alone felt upon entering the village was its sheer mystique. Though he had seen its illustrations countless times, experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. The Thunder Serpent tribe's village had been built atop crumbled ruins. Alone scanned his surroundings. Homes, resembling those of elves, were constructed inside trees, while others were built from restored ruins. Members of the Thunder Serpent tribe, emerging from these structures, stared at Alone's group with wary, distrustful eyes. As the group proceeded through the village under the tribe's scrutinizing gazes, they arrived at the center, where a massive temple stood. Alone marveled at the temple's grandeur, which felt more like a harmonious part of nature than a separate structure. A tribesman with 4 horns gestured toward the temple and said, "Follow me." Entering the temple, the group soon arrived at a large tent inside. Within, they found an elderly man clad in white fur, much like the other tribesmen. He's different from the chieftain I remember from the game, Alone thought as he observed the elder. Despite the wrinkles around his eyes, the elder's gaze was sharp and intelligent as he looked at Alone. I've heard you wish to see me, the elder said. Is that true? At the elder's words addressing him as a distinguished guest, Alone momentarily looked puzzled. Then, it dawned on him, it must have been because of the phrase he had uttered earlier. That's right. That NPC was also treated as a distinguished guest. Recalling the young girl NPC who had joined him in the jungle only to part ways as soon as the mission ended, Alone nodded slightly to himself. Yes, that's correct, he said. First, allow me to introduce myself. I am the one who leads the Thunder Serpent tribe, known as the Wise Ashgull, the elder said. I am Marquis Palacio, Alone responded. As the elder politely bowed his head, Alone mirrored the gesture and introduced himself in turn. Show your respect as well, Ashgull commanded. At his words, the tribesman who had been wearing the four-horned mask earlier removed it. A woman. Alone was secretly surprised. He had assumed the tribesman was a man, but it turned out to be a young woman with a youthful appearance. And not just anyone. Swift Circle. I am Swift Circle, she introduced herself. Realization struck Alone. She was destined to become the future chieftain of the Thunder Serpent tribe. With this newfound understanding, he looked at her with a fresh perspective. And so, Ashgull continued, may I ask what has brought you to seek me out? At the elder's question, Alone began to deliberate on how to explain his intentions. He remained silent for a moment, lost in thought, but soon, with a small nod, he seemed to resolve himself. The reason I have come to the Thunder Serpent tribe, he began, looking directly at the wise Ashgull, is to subjugate the god you revere, Basiliora the Receiver. At this shocking revelation, everyone's mouths fell open in stunned disbelief. Chapter 108. At Alone's words, everyone's jaws dropped in disbelief. Even wise Ashgull, with wrinkles folding over his eyes, was stunned. So was the Swift Circle, who still looked at Alone with cautious wariness. Even Evan, who had been curiously examining one of the giant monster masks in the corner of the tent, froze. Reinhard, who had been casually surveying the surroundings with disinterest like Evan, was no exception. All of them were left gaping. The words that had just come out of Alone's mouth were utterly incomprehensible to anyone present. Among them, Reinhard, in particular, stared at him with an expression that screamed, what in the world did he just say? Though Reinhard currently looked unkempt, having spent long stretches training in the jungle and moving between camps, he still recognized the being Alone had spoken of. The receiver, Basiliora. A savage and massive serpent, it was both the ruler of the eastern region and the deity worshipped by the Thunder Serpent tribe. Many expedition teams avoided conflict with the Thunder Serpent tribe precisely because Basiliora stood behind them. Yet here was Marquis Palacio, boldly declaring his intention to subjugate Basiliora in front of the very tribe that revered it as their god. Is he out of his mind? Reinhard thought, staring at Alone with a genuine sense of disbelief. Of course, he already knew Alone wasn't ordinary. He had heard the rumors and witnessed some of Alone's extraordinary feats firsthand. But no matter how extraordinary, the idea of subjugating Basiliora felt like the height of absurdity, something beyond mere arrogance. That monster. Reinhard recalled the one time he had seen Basiliora. Its massive tail had casually swiped through the jungle, snapping dozens of trees like twigs. Its enormous body towered over the treetops, leaving an impression so indelible that Reinhard could never forget it. And yet, as Reinhard stared incredulously at Deus, who stood beside Marquis Palacio, calmly nodding in agreement, his disbelief deepened. What did you just say? For the first time, wise Ashgull frowned, abandoning his usual calm demeanor. Those are words, no matter how esteemed you may be, that cannot be taken lightly, Ashgull said, his voice tinged with undisguised hostility. But Alone was unfazed. He had already anticipated this reaction. Alone spoke the words he had prepared in advance. Then will you keep living like this? What are you trying to say? Ashgull asked. I'm asking if you will continue offering your people to that god, Alone said bluntly. How? How do you know about that? Ashgull's shocked expression gave him away, a silent admission of the truth. But Alone didn't pause, continuing his argument. Remember this, Ashgull. The god you worship will never stop demanding human sacrifices, not until the Thunder Serpent tribe is utterly destroyed. And how can you be so sure of that? Ashgull challenged. Without hesitation, Alone replied, there's no need for certainty. You already know, don't you? You know it won't stop. Alone's next words were even sharper. If the Thunder Serpent tribe aids me, I'll get rid of it for you. Ashgull fell silent, unable to respond. Alone said no more. Not because he had nothing to add, but because there was no need to. His purpose here was twofold: to force the Thunder Serpent tribe's chief to confront a truth they had long ignored and to offer them a chance for change. After a moment of tense silence, Ashgull finally spoke. Will you give me a day to consider this? I'll wait, Alone replied. And with that, their first meeting ended, leaving the promise of tomorrow hanging in the air. As Alone left the tent with his companions, he glanced back momentarily to see Circle's pupils trembling uncontrollably. Without further hesitation, they exited the shrine. Shortly afterward, Marquis, what's on your mind? Are you really planning to capture that so-called god? Upon returning to the lodging assigned to them by the Thunder Serpent tribe, Evan immediately asked the question. Alone nodded calmly. Yes. Wait, you're serious? I am. Sometimes, I really don't understand you, Marquis. But, are you sure you don't need to explain yourself more? Judging by their reaction, they didn't seem particularly pleased with what you said. Alone responded nonchalantly. They'll likely accept. And why is that? Because they probably don't want to keep offering human sacrifices anymore. Evan clicked his tongue in frustration. As I thought, that's what this is all about. Exactly. But still, do you really think they'll easily go along with your plan? Sure, it's a barbaric practice, but for tribes where human sacrifice is ingrained in their culture, they might not even realize it's wrong. Evan wasn't entirely wrong. Human sacrifice was seen as an unspeakable act in any place governed by basic moral principles. However, in isolated tribes like the Thunder Serpent tribe, whose interaction with the outside world was minimal, it was plausible they lacked the moral framework to question the practice. Still, Evan was mistaken about one thing. The Thunder Serpent tribe wasn't originally a tribe that offered human sacrifices. They're being forced into it. Forced. Though Alone didn't know every detail about them, he was certain of two things. First, the Thunder Serpent tribe had not practiced human sacrifice in the past. Second, the one enforcing the sacrifices was none other than their supposed guardian, Basiliora. Wait, then why wouldn't they accept your proposal? Evan looked puzzled. Alone didn't answer right away, but Reinhard did. Obviously, they're afraid of what will happen if they fail. Isn't it easy to imagine? If the tribe really is being forced into sacrifices, they're probably doing it to avoid being annihilated. That makes sense, but wouldn't it be better for them to just escape to a place where Basiliora doesn't exist? They clearly can't escape. There's something stopping them, which is why they're enduring this humiliation, Reinhard replied. Alone gave Reinhard a long look, impressed. Despite his rough, bandit-like appearance, Reinhard had accurately deduced the situation. Correct. The Thunder Serpent tribe cannot leave this place. To be more precise, they're trapped here. Basiliora is keeping them under surveillance, ensuring they can't escape. Oh. Evan let out a small exclamation of admiration. Briefly puffing up at Deus's gaze of approval, Reinhard then frowned as if something had occurred to him. Wait a second. Why do you all look so surprised? Is it that shocking that I figured this out? Well, because your brain works faster than your looks suggest. Deus quipped. Oh, that's cough. Evan nodded enthusiastically, only to clear his throat awkwardly when he noticed Reinhard glaring at him. Quickly changing the subject, Evan asked, anyway, why won't Basiliora let the tribe leave? The urgency in his tone drew Alone's attention. Because of their faith, most likely, Alone thought. Basiliora relied on the Thunder Serpent tribe's faith as a source of power, fully aware of how much it strengthened him. To Basiliora, the tribe wasn't just a protectorate, it was a precious supply of faith. The problem, however, was that Basiliora had realized fear and human sacrifice could generate even more faith than protection ever could. And surely, the chieftain knows that truth as well. Alone recalled the bitterness in Circle's voice during the game as she recounted the truth about the human sacrifices, a secret passed down from the previous chieftain. I don't know the exact reasons myself, Alone said, evading further explanation. The full story would take too long to share. Anyway, let's wait and see. With those words, he took his seat. 3 hours later. Is it really, truly possible to capture Basiliora? Alone looked at Circle, who had returned much sooner than expected. He had anticipated that it would take a day or two for the tribe to hold a meeting and reach a decision, but Circle came to him in just 3 hours. Yes, Alone replied calmly with a nod. My younger sister is the next sacrifice. It didn't take long for Alone to understand why the decision had come so quickly. So that's why the meeting ended so fast. Yes. If we act now, we can still save my sister. It couldn't have been easy to convince the others. The chieftain and I agreed to take full responsibility. Alone paused for a moment, considering the risk she and the chieftain were taking. Could she truly shoulder the consequences if they failed? He quickly dismissed the thought and nodded. Given Basiliora's nature, the Thunder Serpent tribe was too valuable for the entity to simply annihilate. Their lives alone, hers and the chieftain's, might suffice as compensation. But for Alone, failure was never an option. Then let's discuss what needs to be done. Alone began explaining the steps to Circle, whose expression was resolute. Jenna, the younger sister of Circle, the Thunder Serpent tribe's strongest warrior. She had just turned 16 and was set to undergo the coming-of-age ceremony, earning her tribal name alongside others her age. But now, she stood alone atop the temple roof, gazing at the rain as it fell in heavy drops. Dark clouds, streaked with shades of grey, deepened as twilight approached. Jenna glanced down at her hands. In her palm was an apple. It was her last meal, a gift from her sister, whom she loved dearly. The apple had been handed to her by Circle, who, for the first time, had shed tears while pressing it into her hands. Jenna stared blankly at the once vivid red apple, now dulled like the grey sky above. Circle had told her to eat it, but Jenna hadn't. No, she couldn't. Despite her hunger, despite her love for apples, she couldn't bring herself to eat it. The moment she bit into it, she felt, would mark the end. Eating it would mean being alone. The fear of that final moment kept her from taking even a single bite. She knew this was her last meal. It's pointless. Jenna wasn't ignorant. She knew that holding onto the apple wouldn't keep her sister by her side. She knew the inevitable end wouldn't be stopped. She wanted to run. A sudden, overwhelming impulse flashed through her mind, but her body didn't move. Running would only make her sister the next sacrifice. She understood that too well. So she stood still, watching the grey sky darken further into night. Until... Kugu. She saw it. Something enormous, gliding toward her. The great god she worshipped. The god she never wished to face. Death had come for her. Smashing through the trees with its sheer size, the massive serpent, no, the receiver, Basiliora, slithered effortlessly around the colossal altar. Its enormous eyes locked onto her. The reptilian pupil, larger than her entire body, bore into her. Ah! Fear overtook her. Her body trembled uncontrollably. The apple slipped from her hands, landing in the rain-soaked ground. Her mind screamed for survival. I want to live. I want to live. I want to live. I want to live. The thought repeated endlessly, burning in her mind. But deep down, she knew. No matter how much she begged or cried, no one was coming to save her. Her death had already been decided. And so, all she could do was silently weep as she stood there, frozen in terror. The receiver, who seemed to savor her fear, opened its gargantuan jaws, large enough to swallow a house in one bite, to devour her. But then... Arctic freeze. A voice rang out. Crack, crack, crack. Everything atop the altar froze solid. The ground. The rainwater pooling on the floor. Even the apple Jenna had dropped. The rain falling from the sky froze, every drop suspended in ice. And then, from the edge of the altar, step, step. A man walked forward, unfazed, his expression indifferent as the frozen rain brushed against him. In one hand, he carried a swirl of greyish-white magic. Floating beside him was a rectangular mass of iron, roughly half his size. As he ascended the stairs, he muttered something under his breath, too quiet for anyone to hear. But immediately after... Crack! The rectangular iron mass twisted unnaturally, reshaping itself into a massive spear. The god, the receiver, Basiliora, instinctively felt threatened. It tried to close its gaping jaws, but... its mouth wouldn't close. Within the cavernous, ash-grey expanse of its maw, bright violet threads crisscrossed widely, forcibly holding the god's mouth wide open. The moment it realized this, Basiliora's massive body, coiled around the altar, began to convulse. Rumble! With just one twist of its colossal frame, the entire altar shook as though an earthquake had struck. Yet the man remained undeterred. He calmly climbed the remaining steps and passed by Genira, who stood frozen in fear, before stopping in front of the god. With another quiet murmur, he raised his hand, forming a gesture like a gun with his index and middle fingers pointed forward. Pierce! He spoke the final word. Boom! A massive bolt of lightning struck. The iron spear shot forth, shattering through Basiliora's upper jaw with an earth-shaking impact. And then, the god fell. Basiliora, pierced and defeated, tumbled down the altar, its divine majesty shattered. And Genira, frozen where she stood, stared blankly at the man who had brought down such a god.